Okay, our topic today is Measure for Measure. So, of the plays classified as comedies, Measure for Measure is my personal favorite. It's included with the comedies in the folio. I think it appears between The Merry Wives of Windsor and The Comedy of Errors. Um, Structurally, it aligns in certain respects with other comedies we've read. There are romantic relationships that spawn some intense crisis that threatens the lives of one or more characters. You might think of Hermione in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or Rosalind in As You Like It. Both of them are threatened with execution. Hero in Much Ado About Nothing, whose father wishes she was dead. In Measure for Measure, it's Claudio who's sentenced to have his head chopped off for fornication, that is, premarital sex with his fiancée Juliet. In each case, in all these plays, these crises are resolved employing various stratagems of disguise, of deception, culminating finally in a marriage or marriages that reestablish social harmony. But compared to the festive comedies, Measure for Measure feels a lot different. In As You Like It, in Twelfth Night, Midsummer Night's Dream, the characters have more freedom of movement. For example, the action frequently takes place outdoors, in forests and gardens. And the atmosphere of Measure for Measure, by contrast, is almost stifling. It's carceral, it's claustrophobic. A number of scenes take place in prisons and monasteries. I think of it as Shakespeare's most Gothic play, resembling the novels of the late 18th century, Gothic novels of the late 18th century by Matthew Lewis, by Anne Radcliffe, in which the primary villains are decadent noblemen or religious zealots who persecute and molest chaste women in ruined castles and dungeons. The imagery of Measure for Measure is dark, at times morbid, and there's a cynicism about sexual desire that is more characteristic of a play like Hamlet than any of Shakespeare's other comedies. And we'll talk about that problematic aspect of the play a little bit later in the video. So I've got a few points I want to touch on. It was performed for King James I in December 1604. That's the earliest date for which we have record of the play. And it was probably composed around that time, but it did not appear in print until the 1623 folio. And by that time, it had been amended by Shakespeare's one-time collaborator and his eventual successor as the house playwright for the Kingsmen, Thomas Middleton. The basic plot of Measure for Measure is derived from an earlier play, Promos and Cassandra. This is a 1578 play by a man named George Weston, a good friend of the poet George Gascoigne. And Weston's play was itself based on an earlier Italian source. So this play, Measure for Measure, is arguably Shakespeare's most sexual play. Two characters, Mistress Overdone and Pompey, are employed in the sex trade. Mistress Overdone is the proprietor of a couple of brothels. Pompey's a pimp. Several other characters appearing in the play are their clients. In the earlier festive comedies, heterosexual desire is always channeled into socially appropriate marriages that resolve conflict and shore up family structures. But here in Measure for Measure, that sexual desire incites lascivious behavior that strains family relationships and undermines social order. As happens in As You Like It, the denouement culminates in 4 marriages. Only this time, the marriages are they don't seem particularly happy. There isn't the sense of celebration or festive a festive atmosphere like we find in the earlier comedies. So given the play's sordid atmosphere and its emphasis on carnal appetite, it is noteworthy that Measure for Measure is also Shakespeare's most explicitly religious play, and the only one that alludes to the scriptures in its title, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, 1, 2. It contains several religious characters, 5 of them, including the Duke in his disguise as Friar Lodwick, and it has a distinctly drawn Catholic setting. While the comedic device of multiple matrimony marks the play's finale, these marriages, as I said before, in various ways vexed or coerced, are subsumed within larger problems of justice and absolution that have puzzled and frustrated generations of readers, which I'll show you in a moment. I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about the 1623 text. Measure for Measure predates Shakespeare's collaborations with his fellow playwright Thomas Middleton. We know that the two worked together, for example, on Timon of Athens. That was a few years after this. But we can be reasonably certain that Middleton made modifications to the play, to Measure for Measure, after Shakespeare's death in 1616 and prior to its publication in the 1623 folio. It was probably Middleton who, for topical reasons, relocated the setting of the play from Italy to Vienna. None of Shakespeare's other plays are set in Germanic countries, and there are various arguments to be made that this was an adaptation of Middleton. The boys' song in Act 4, Take, Oh, Take Those Lips Away, we know that this song postdates Shakespeare. It's taken from Fletcher and Massinger's play Rollo, Duke of Normandy, which was performed in 1617. The song was quite popular, and so the idea is, just integrate a popular song, a well-known song, into the play when it was performed probably in the early 1620s, when it was revived probably in the early 1620s. And the exchange between Mariana and the Duke immediately after the song was likely also added by Middleton. But the most compelling and substantive evidence of alteration to the original text occurs in Act 1, Scene 2, in which Lucio converses with two gentlemen about political news that would have been topical for theater audiences around 1621. And I'll put the folio text up in just a moment. Mistress Overdone, the bawd, enters in that scene and informs the group, Lucio and the gentleman, about Claudio's arrest. And these facts, she apparently didn't know these things in the original text, as is suggested a few lines later in her conversation with the tapster Pompey. So this might be a little clearer if I put the folio text up for you. This is, again, Act 1, Scene 2, and I'm going to highlight a couple of passages here. Here's the first one. This is the Norton, lines 56 to 67, and Mistress Overdone comes in and she says, well, there's one yonder arrested and carried to prison, was worth 5,000 of you all. And one of the gentlemen, the second gentleman, says, well, who's that, I pray thee? And she says, well, marry, sir, that's Claudio, Signor Claudio. And the first gentleman says, Claudio to prison? 'Tis not so. And she says, nay, but I know 'tis so. I saw him arrested, saw him carried away, and which is more, within these 3 days, his head to be chopped off. And Lucio says, but after all this fooling, I would not have it so. Art thou sure of this? And she says, I'm too sure of it, and it is for getting Madame Julietta with child. Well, the conversation ends shortly after this, and Pompey the clown enters, and she has another conversation with the clown. This is lines 78 to 84. And the clown says, well, yonder man is carried to prison. And now all of a sudden she seems clueless. Well, what has he done? And Pompey says jokingly, he did a woman. And she says, but what's his offense? And the clown Pompey says, groping for trouts in a peculiar river. What? Is there a maid with child by him? And Pompey says, no, but there's a woman with maid by him. And then the conversation switches over to the proclamation closing down the brothels in Vienna. So there's a discrepancy here. There's an inconsistency regarding what Mistress Overdone knows about Claudio and Juliet. So the idea is that this entire section I've highlighted in gray or blue-gray here, that all of this was Middleton, that he added this first scene to include some political references that would have been understood by audiences in the early 1620s, and he rewrote the scene so that it's Mistress Overdone who reveals Claudio's arrest and his crime, and that the scene in red below the clown's entrance there would have been deleted from the folio text, but that in the process of casting off, the compositor perhaps didn't understand the direction to delete that passage, and so both passages were left, and textual scholars have hypothesized that that's why we see evidence of crowding on the page, that the compositor ran out of space because he didn't know what text needed to be removed. So we see evidence of the crowding of text, like, for example, in the arrow I'm pointing to, the stage direction, where all of the characters that enter in scene 3 enter together, even though those stage directions do not make sense. So there's other evidence of textual crowding as well. And again, the idea was that passage in red that you see there was supposed to be deleted from the folio text. So Charlotte Lennox, an important 18th century Shakespearean scholar, she did a lot of work in tracing some of Shakespeare's sources. This is what she said about Measure for Measure. She did not like the play, that Shakespeare made a wrong choice of his subject, since he was resolved to torture it into comedy, appears by the low contrivance. She's probably thinking of the bed switch, I think, the bed switch scene with Mariana and Isabella. Absurd intrigue and improbable incidents he was obligated to introduce in order to bring about 3 or 4 weddings instead of one good beheading. So it sounds like she would prefer that the play were written as the tragedy of Angelo, perhaps. And throughout the 19th century, very important Shakespeare critics said more disparaging things about it. Here's Coleridge, probably the greatest literary critic of his generation. This play is to me the most painful, or say rather, the only painful part of Shakespeare's genuine works. The comic and tragic parts equally border on the hateful, the one disgusting, the other horrible. Our feelings of justice are grossly wounded in Angelo's escape. Isabella herself contrives to be unamiable, and Claudio is detestable. These sentiments were echoed later in the 19th century by another great reader and critic of Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, Algernon Charles Swinburne, who said, "Justice is not merely evaded or ignored or even defied. She is deliberately baffled, buffeted, outraged, insulted, struck in the face. We are left hungry and thirsty after having been made to thirst and hunger for some wholesome single grain at least of righteous and too long retarded retribution. We are tricked out of our dole, defeated of our due, lured and led on to look for some equitable and satisfying upshot, defrauded and derided, and sent empty away." So lots of readers and critics responded negatively to the play. And one reader, Frank Boas, said this, made this insightful observation about it. All these dramas, and he's linking Measure for Measure with several other plays, Hamlet, All's Well That End Well. He says all these dramas introduce us into highly artificial societies whose civilization is ripe unto rottenness. Amidst such media, abnormal conditions of brain and of emotion are generated, and intricate cases of conscience demand a solution by unprecedented methods. Thus, throughout these plays, we move along dim, untrodden paths, and at the close, our feeling is neither of simple joy nor pain. We are excited, fascinated, perplexed, for the issues raised preclude a completely satisfactory outcome, even when the complications are outwardly adjusted in the fifth act. Dramas so singular in theme and temper cannot be strictly called comedies or tragedies. We may therefore class them together as Shakespeare's problem plays. So that term, although not all critics agree with it, but that term problem play stuck. And so problem plays include Measure for Measure, Hamlet, like I said, All's Well That Ends Well, and some of the plays called romances to fit into this category. So Measure for Measure is a problem play. Let's talk about now some of the key characters that will feature in the scenes that we look at a little later. We have Vincentio, the Duke of Vienna. Later, he is, for much of the play, actually, he's disguised as Friar Lothwick. And here is a list of the actors. This is from the 1623 folio. And you'll see that Vincentio is listed there as the Duke, even though he is never named Vincentio in the text of the play. And the scene is set, like I said earlier, in Vienna, despite most of the characters having these beautiful Italian names. So there's Angelo, whom the Duke deputizes to rule in his place, which we'll talk about later. And then around Angelo are these the advisor Aeschylus, and then the provost, who basically is responsible for imprisoning and executing those convicted of crimes. Angelo has relationships with two women in the play, Isabella and Mariana. We'll talk about both of these women and their relationship to Angelo a little later. And then Isabella has a brother, Claudio, and his fiancée, Juliet. And then on the other side, I'm going to add Lucio, who is a friend of Claudio, and Pompey the pimp, Pompey the clown. So these will be the characters that we focus on most. So here is a scene from the play. This is Act 5, Scene 1, the only scene in Act 5. This is an engraving based on a painting by Thomas Kirk for the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery series, and I've shown several of these in other videos now. If you'd like, you can pause the video here and see if you can identify these characters. That's always a fun thing to do, I think. And this one's not particularly easy. I find the female characters a little ambiguous. We can say with confidence that this is Vincentio. There he is. He's unveiling himself. His Friar Lothwick disguise is being cast off. And there's the provost who's holding the keys because Aeschylus and Angelo have ordered the Duke to be arrested because they didn't realize it was the Duke. They thought it was Friar Lothwick. And the provost steps over with the keys to take Vincentio off to prison. And then he reveals himself. Or actually, I think it's Lucio who grabs him, and his hood comes off his head and reveals the truth. There's Angelo, who is obviously mortified by the discovery. And I think this is Mariana over here and Friar Peter. And Mariana has been revealed as Angelo's former fiancé. There's Lucio, who's now very nervous because he realizes that he's been saying rather awful things about the Duke without realizing he was talking to the Duke. There's Aeschylus, and then maybe that's Isabella back there, even though she is she just doesn't look right there to me. That's just not how I picture Isabella. So I could be wrong about that. I could have Mariana and Isabella backwards, perhaps, but I feel pretty confident in my attribution. So let's summarize the play. We've got, of course, the 5 acts, and 2 of them, Act 3 and Act 5, are just one long extended scene. Act 1 is 4 scenes. Duke Vincentio departs Vienna on urgent business in Poland, he says, and deputizes Angelo to rule in his place. One of Angelo's first actions is to arrest and sentence Claudio to death for having sex with Juliet out of wedlock. And Juliet is pregnant with his child. In addition to this, he issues a proclamation shutting down Vienna's brothels. Mistress Overdone and Pompey, both of who are involved in the sex trade, are discussing these matters when they observe Claudio and Juliet suffering public humiliation en route to prison. Claudio explains to his friend Lucio that he's engaged to Juliet, that they were simply waiting for the settlement of her dowry before finalizing their nuptials, and that Angelo, overzealous in his new position of authority, is executing laws that have not been enforced in Vienna for years. He requests that Lucio go to his sister, Isabella, who is preparing to take holy orders, and ask her to intercede with Angelo on his behalf. Meanwhile, the Duke, now concealed in a monastery, explains to Friar Thomas that his rule has been too lax, that his failure to enforce statutes governing sexual morality has allowed vice to run rampant. Vienna has become a cesspool. He believes that the people will perceive him as capricious and unjust if he were suddenly to reverse his stance, and therefore he's commissioned the morally staunch Angelo to clean up the city while he retreats and observes. Lucio visits Isabella at St. Clair's and explains to her Claudio's dire circumstances and urges her to intercede, which she will do. So in Act 2, then, which is 4 scenes, it opens with Aeschylus counseling Angelo on the necessity of restraint and compassion in prosecuting moral offenses, but Angelo moves forward with an order to execute Claudio the next morning. This very somber exchange is followed by a comic interlude initiated by Constable Elbow. He's been cuckolded by his pregnant wife. He's arrested Pompey the pimp and his client Froth and presents them to Angelo for judgment. Pompey proves too quick-witted for the inept Elbow. Angelo gets bored with the disputation and just turns the case over to Aeschylus, who eventually dismisses the charges and releases Pompey with a stern warning. Hopeful she can obtain clemency for her brother, Isabella meets with Angelo, but accomplishes really nothing more than awakening Angelo's sexual desire. The Duke, meanwhile, still disguised as Friar Lodwig, arrives at the prison to survey Angelo's progress in cleaning up the city. After learning of Claudio's crime, he meets Juliet and is impressed by her piety and virtue. Then at their second meeting, Angelo propositions Isabella to have sex with him in exchange for Claudio's life. Indignant, Isabella rejects any bargain that jeopardizes her own soul. she accepts her brother's sentence and departs to counsel Claudio in preparation for torture and death. So the long Act 3, this is a painting by William Holman Hunt in 1850. This shows Claudio in prison with his sister Isabella. Just a gut-wrenching scene. So the Duke, as Friar Lodwick, he offers spiritual counsel to Claudio on the eve of his execution. When Isabella arrives, he listens in. The Duke listens in as she and Claudio disagree over whether she should accept Angelo's proposal, as you can imagine. So afterward, the Duke approaches Isabella with a plan to expose Angelo's hypocrisy. He reveals that Angelo was once betrothed to a woman named Mariana, but broke it off when her dowry was lost at sea. In the 5 years since that time, she's been living in solitude near the monastery of St. Luke's. The Duke intends to hold Angelo to account by tricking him into sexual intercourse with Mariana. The plan is for Isabella to feign consent to Angelo's proposal and then switch her out for Mariana under the cover of darkness, the bed switch. Meanwhile, Elbow has apprehended Pompey again. Pompey appeals to his friend and frequent customer Lucio, who is too mindful of his own neck to lend his aid to a pimp. Unaware that he's addressing the Duke, Lucio criticizes Angelo's governance as too severe and impractical, and goes on to impugn the Duke's morality. Rather than expose his real identity at this point, the Duke advises Lucio to make his accusations public upon the Duke's return to Vienna, which will happen. Pompey's accomplice, meanwhile, Mistress Overdone, has also been arrested, apparently betrayed by Lucio, and is on her way to prison. She protests that Lucio is a hypocrite and accuses him of breaking his engagement to a woman, a sex worker named Kate Keepdown, who has already borne him a child. And in fact, this becomes important in Act 5. Preparations for Claudio's execution move forward, and the Duke informs the provost that Claudio has come to terms with his situation and is ready to die. Act 4 is 6 scenes. This painting is by Dante Gabriel Rossetti from 1870. This is Mariana and the boy singing a song at the very beginning of Act 4. The choice of the subject of Mariana, this was a very personal one for the painter, for Rossetti. The model for the painting was Jane Morris, who was the wife of his best friend and business partner, William Morris. But her husband, William, was complete workaholic. He was frequently away from home, and the marriage was apparently not happy by the time she started sitting for Rossetti's paintings. And it's likely the two became involved in a quiet but very intense love affair that lasted until his death in 1882, Rossetti's death in 1882. But the choice of Mariana, the poor woman abandoned by her fiance Angelo, certainly appropriate for Jane Morris and her situation in 1870. So the Duke, Isabella, and Mariana execute their plan to ensnare Angelo. Later, the Duke arrives at the prison, still disguised as Lodwick, expecting any moment for the provost to receive a letter from Angelo commuting Claudio's sentence. Because Angelo, remember, promised to release Claudio if Isabella agreed to sleep with him. But instead, word comes not only to proceed with the execution, but also to deliver over Claudio's severed head. A rather bizarre request, actually producing the remains of the criminal. The Duke urges the provost not to execute Claudio, but to present instead the head of another condemned criminal named Barnardine. He promises that if he does this, the Duke will return to Vienna and settle Claudio's case before the deceit is discovered. Later, the Duke is troubled by Barnardine's state of mind the next morning when he goes to get him for his execution, but he has no choice but to allow the execution to proceed. But then the provost informs him that another prisoner, Ragozine, has just died of a fever, and the Duke now seizes the opportunity to spare the lives of two men, Claudio's as well as Barnardine's, by switching Ragozine's head for Claudio's and then hiding both Claudio and Barnardine until he can pardon them in his legitimate role as Duke. When Isabella arrives at the prison, the Duke tells her that their strategy failed, and Angelo, he went ahead with the execution of her brother, and he promises the Duke will ensure justice is done when he arrives the next day, and he begins coordinating with Friar Peter to make a grand public spectacle of Angelo's hypocrisy, which is where we are in Act 5. Here's a painting by William Hamilton, 1793, very similar to the painting by Thomas Kirk that we looked at earlier. There's Isabella confronting Angelo and Aeschylus there. So the Duke is welcomed back to Vienna in Act 5. Isabella approaches him immediately with her accusations against Angelo. Angelo dismisses her testimony as the ravings of a woman grieving the loss of a depraved brother. And the Duke goes along with this for a while. Next, Mariana is deposed to confute Isabella's charge, but her testimony serves to further deepen Angelo's guilt. Finally, Angelo acknowledges his broken engagement to Mariana, but denies that they had conjugal contact. The Duke defends Angelo's character and implicates Isabella and Mariana in a conspiracy orchestrated by one Friar Lodwick, which of course we know is the Duke himself. And the Duke summons Friar Lodwick to appear before the court to answer the charge. The Duke basically turns the matter over to Aeschylus and Angelo, and he exits, and he later re-enters as Lodwick, and he defends the women and slights Angelo and Aeschylus, who order his immediate arrest. And at this point, the Duke throws off his disguise with some wardrobe assistance from Lucio, no longer able to deny Isabella and Mariana's charges, and now compromised in his own values and legal ethics. Angelo submits to the Duke and asks for the severest possible punishment, which of course would be death. Instead, the Duke orders Angelo and Mariana to be married and then sentences Angelo to death for Claudio's unjust murder. Mariana pleads for his life, and Isabella supports her petition. We'll have to look at that because that's a scene that critics of the play it's infuriating to some. She makes exculpatory statements on Angelo's behalf. And then at last, in one final anagnorisis, Claudio is revealed to be among the living. The Duke exonerates Angelo since Claudio is in fact still alive. He pardons both Claudio and Barnardine and sentences Lucio to marry Kate Keepdown, and then himself proposes marriage to Isabella. And then the play comes to a very abrupt and solemn conclusion. Okay, so with a summary of the play complete, we can look now at some specific scenes in a little more detail, a little closer. We're going to start with the Duke's rationale for his decision to step aside and deputize Angelo. Based largely on Angelo's public reputation, which is confirmed by Lucio in some of these scenes. So we'll take a look at Act 1, Scene 3, lines 7 to 54, and then some of Lucio's remarks in Scene 4, also Act 1, Scene 4, lines 51 to 62. So this first scene is an important conversation between the Duke and Friar Thomas. explaining the Duke's decision to step aside and leave Angelo in charge of the city. Essentially, one of the things that stands out here is the Duke's admission of fault for not executing laws governing public morality. You can look specifically here at lines 23 to 31 for that. Now, as fond fathers, he says, having bound up the threatening twigs of birch only to stick it in their children's sight for terror, not to use, in time the rod more mocked than feared becomes. So our decrees, dead to infliction, to themselves are dead, and liberty plucks justice by the nose, the baby beats the nurse, and quite athwart goes all decorum. He goes on to say here that it would appear arbitrary and unreasonable, perhaps unreasonable enough to destabilize his regime, if he were to suddenly reverse his stance on laws that have not been enforced for many years. He rationalizes that it would make more sense to appoint Angelo, a man known for self-control and moral severity, to do the work for him while he pretends to be away on legitimate state business. He also hints here, curiously, at line 48, at more reasons for this action to Friar Thomas, but offers no explanation here. And the implication, in retrospect, seems to be that he already knows about Angelo's broken engagement with Mariana, and that he intends by some means to redress it. But he goes ahead and praises Angelo, who he says scarce confesses that his blood flows or that his appetite is more to bread than stone. This opinion is corroborated later by Lucio in scene 4 when he meets with Isabella. And he describes Lord Angelo as a man whose blood is very snow broth, one who never feels the wanton stings and motions of the sense, but doth rebate and blunt his natural edge with profits of the mind, study, and fast. Now, all this praise for Angelo in Act 1 seems to be setting him up to fail spectacularly later in the play. So the next scene here, we'll Act 2, Scene 1, lines 1 through 31. The focus here is actually Aeschylus, who's advising Angelo to prosecute these moral laws with some restraint and compassion. Aeschylus is a really interesting, very intriguing figure to me. He's a sage figure, very wise. He's older. He is the voice of moderation. Angelo ignores his counsel. But Aeschylus, I wonder if he's named after the Greek playwright Aeschylus, whose trilogy of plays, the Oresteia, uses the murder of King Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra and the matricidal violence that follows from that. Aeschylus was using that story as an allegory of Greece's evolution from a barbaric civilization plagued by cycles of blood vengeance, of retributive violence, to its evolution to a rational polity that relies on dispassionate justice. So I think if that's true, then it makes sense for Aeschylus to play the role that he does in this play. His statement in lines 4 through 16 here closely echo the sentiment of the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew, from which the title of the play is derived. Angelo's cold response to Aeschylus's counsel here, what's open made to justice, that justice seizes, he says. We can only prosecute the crimes we see, not the ones we don't. And this foreshadows the denouement in Act 5 when his relationship with Mariana is publicly divulged. So Act 1, Scene 2, lines 113 to 174. This is This is significant. It's Claudio's explanation for the situation that he's in, explaining his relationship with Juliet, and also commenting on Angelo. It's a very revealing conversation with his friend Lucio. I'm not sure what having a friendship with Lucio says about Claudio's character. Lucio is hardly an admirable figure in the play. But in any case, Claudio admits to fornication. That is, he admits to sex outside of wedlock. And he seems genuinely remorseful about it here. But he follows that by saying that he and Juliet are in love, that they're engaged to be married. And such a promise would have been regarded by many at that time, in the late 17th and late 16th and early 17th centuries, as a sufficient precondition for sex. And we know that Shakespeare himself, without doubt, had sex with his wife, Anne Hathaway, before they were married. And we know that because they had a daughter just 5 months after the wedding. Claudio further explains here that they were just waiting on the settlement of Juliet's dowry before proceeding with the wedding. But then their affair was exposed by her pregnancy. I also like the lines here commenting on Angelo's abuse of power. Lines 145 to 53. He says, "The new Duke deputy now for the Duke, whether it be the fault and glimpse of newness, or whether that the body politic be a horse whereon the governor doth ride, who, newly in the seat, that it may know he can command, lets it straight feel the spur, whether the tyranny be in his place, or in his eminence that fills it up, I stagger in." This conversation ends with Claudio requesting that Lucio go to St. Clare's, a convent, and seek out Claudio's sister, Isabella, who's preparing to become a nun, to take orders and become a nun, and ask her to appeal to Angelo to have mercy on her brother. And Angelo agrees to do that, which brings us to Act 2, Scene 2, lines 57 to 189. This is the exchange. Two exchanges actually will occur. This is the first between Isabella and Claudio. This is a lengthy back and forth between the two on the topic of pity and justice. Very, very interesting conversation. Angelo answers her arguments at first, but with Lucio, Lucio, who's always kind of on the side, sort of poking characters to say things, he's coaching her through this and says, you're not saying the right things. You're not being passionate enough. And finally, she begins to prevail over Angelo when her arguments start to touch on pride and guilt and hypocrisy. So if you look at lines 135 to 42, she says, "Authority, though it err like others, hath yet a kind of medicine in itself that skins the vice of the top. Go to your bosom," she says, "knock there, and ask your heart what it doth know that's like my brother's fault. If it confess a natural guiltiness such as is his, let it not sound a thought upon your tongue against my brother's life." A little later in this conversation, she offers what she calls a bribe, that in exchange for her brother's life, she offers the prayers of the Sisterhood of St. Clare's, lines 150 to 56. "True prayers," she says, "that shall be up at heaven and enter there ere sunrise. Prayers from preserved souls, from fasting maids, whose minds are dedicate to nothing temporal." Whether it is here the idea of exchange, the offer of prayers for Angelo's life, so that sort of quid pro quo idea, or the image that Isabella plants in Angelo's imagination of young virgins dedicating their thoughts to him all night, this encounter triggers sexual arousal in Angelo, which is apparently a new sensation for him, and he expresses his torment after their conversation in soliloquy. And it's clear that it is Isabella's purity, her chastity, that excites his libidinal appetite. What's this? What's this? He says. Is this her fault or mine? The tempter or the tempted who sins most, huh? Not she, nor doth she tempt, but it is I that lying by the violet in the sun do as the carrion does, not as the flower, corrupt with virtuous season. Can it be that modesty may more betray our sense than woman's lightness? Having waste ground enough, shall we desire to raise the sanctuary and pitch our evils there? O cunning enemy, that to catch a saint with saints dost bait thy hook. So the next scene, they 2 scenes later, they have a second interview, and in this one, Angelo makes the indecent proposal. So Isabella returns to negotiate her brother's reprieve at Angelo's request. At first, their talk turns on the question of whether the commission of sin to save the life of another person may be considered charity, thereby absolving the person of guilt. This is a really important conversation. The idea that if you sin to save a life, is it really a sin, or are you guilty of the sin, or could it be considered charity, self-sacrifice? Isabella seems to agree that it would be charity, until she finally catches the drift that Angelo is referring to her virginity, proposing that he will pardon her brother if she agrees to have sex with him. You must lay down the treasure of your body, he says. And her response, better it were a brother died at once than a sister by redeeming him should die forever. So that's pretty unequivocal. And Angelo calls her out on that. He says, were not you then as cruel as the sentence that you have slandered so? And she responds, ignominy and ransom and free pardon are of 2 houses, she says. Lawful mercy is nothing kin to foul redemption. So Isabella, her next strategy is to try to blackmail Angelo by threatening to expose his hypocrisy. But he quite rightly states that his public reputation, his standing, is so solid that she would only end up damaging her own reputation. Again, he's probably right about that. He doubles down and says that if she refuses him now, not only will Claudio be executed, but he's going to torture him first. Like their previous conversation 2 scenes earlier, this one ends with a soliloquy starting at line 168, only this time it's Isabella who's speaking, and part of her soliloquy is about the abuse of power. It's really some really powerful lines. She says, "Oh, perilous mouths that bear in them one and the selfsame tongue, either of condemnation or of proof, bidding the law make curtsy to their will, hooking both right and wrong to the appetite, to follow as it draws." And this is followed by a scene between the Duke and Claudio. This is Act 3 now. Act 3, Scene 1, lines 1 through 44. The Duke is disguised as a friar and counsels Claudio on death. I'm not going to read any of it here, but it's an excellent consolation poem about human vanity, about putting too much value in material things, earthly goods, and relationships, rather than focusing on the hereafter and the greater joys of spiritual life in heaven. So finally, we get this pivotal scene between Isabel and Claudio. She reveals what Angelo proposed from line 63 to 151, and their respective positions are summed up pretty well, I think, in 3 lines 115 to 117, where Isabella, after explaining the proposition, she's like, well, what says my brother? And Claudio says, death is a fearful thing. And Isabella says, and a shamed life a hateful. So Claudio answers that with this really impassioned, vividly imagined speech, with lots of allusions to Dante Alighieri in there on the fear of death. And it's a speech that just, it's rich, and it resounds with echoes of the finer speeches of Hamlet. So I'll start one here at line 118. To die and go we know not where, to to lie in cold obstruction and to rot. The sensible, warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and uncertain thought imagine howling. 'Tis too horrible. The weariest and most loathed worldly life that age, ache, penury, and imprisonment can lay on nature is a paradise to what we fear of death. The exchange comes to a head when Claudio argues what sin you do to save a brother's life becomes a virtue. This is an echo of that earlier conversation between Isabella and Angelo. And Isabella is enraged. Her response has elicited different but equally valid reactions from readers. But just speaking for myself, coming from these words coming from a Catholic novitiate and one who later in the play will forgive Angelo for his crimes, her words here seem excessive, merciless even. She says, "I'll pray 1,000 prayers for thy death," she says. "Mercy to thee would prove itself a bawd. 'Tis best that thou diest quickly." That's pretty harsh. So we'll turn now to the bed switch, the famous bed switch trick plan. Isabella, who would not endanger her soul by sacrificing her chastity to save Claudio, and accuses Claudio of deserving his death, essentially for having for fornicating with Juliet. Here, she enthusiastically agrees to participate in an elaborate deceit to trick a man into having sex out of wedlock and compel him into a marriage he does not want. So that's certainly an interesting point to consider. Some might think the Duke's rationalization to Isabella here sounds similar to Claudio's appeal to her just moments earlier. The Duke says, "If you think well to carry this as you may, the doubleness of the benefit defends the deceit from reproof." And that's all it takes, really, to bring Isabella on board with the plan. And again, that's laid out from lines 193 to 255 of Act 3, Scene 1. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to Act 4, Scene 2, lines 122 to 146, and Act 4, Scene 3, lines 18 to 74. I put these two together because this is another switch scene. This time it's a head switch. And the focus is Barnardine. He is another intriguing character. I did not include him in the list of characters earlier in this video, but he's really interesting. A man guilty of a capital offense who is at one point set to be executed ahead of schedule to provide a decoy head to buy time to save Claudio's life. But then the Duke, who goes to fetch him from his cell, is disturbed by the provost's account of Barnardine's drunkenness, his hopelessness, and disregard for his own life. So Barnardine is portrayed as a spiritually destitute man, and therefore the Duke concludes that he's unfit for execution. The Duke feels like, this is awful, but I have to go through with this. But then his life is spared. Barnardine's life is spared by another prisoner, Ragozine, who dies naturally of a fever and whose head will be presented to Angelo instead of Claudio's. So thus, Barnardine's life is miraculously spared, and he'll be pardoned at the end of the play and afforded an opportunity for redemption and spiritual counsel in the end. And one wonders if this isn't Shakespeare expressing some criticism of the prison system in England and more generally, and the lack of regard for the salvation of the condemned. Act 4, Scene 4, lines 18 through 32. This is the beginning of Angelo's remorse. Upon learning of the Duke's arrival, In Vienna, Angelo begins to feel guilty for essentially compelling Isabella to have sex with him. Remember, he doesn't realize yet that he's been duped, that he actually had sex with Mariana. And then he feels guilty as well because he has reneged on his agreement with Isabella and gone forward with Claudio's execution, which he justifies by saying that had he not killed Claudio, Claudio would have sought to avenge his sister's degradation. So this was a prophylactic execution, I guess you might say. So Act 5, Scene 1. This is one of the most troubling scenes in the play, given what happened earlier in Act 3. Mariana and Isabella here plea for Angelo's life. Angelo has been sentenced to death by the Duke for murder, essentially. Now the Duke knows that this isn't real, that Claudio is in fact still alive, but nobody else does, including Isabella. Mariana says, "Sweet Isabel, take my part, lend me your knees, and all my life to come I'll lend you all my life to do you service." And the Duke says, "Oh, this is futile. Against all sense you do importune her. Should she kneel down in mercy of this fact, her brother's ghost his paved bed would break, and take her hence in horror." Really gothic image of her brother's ghost coming to take away his sister for forgiving his murderer. And Mariana continues, "Isabel, they say best men are molded out of faults, and for the most become much more the better for being a little bad. So may my husband. Oh, Isabel, will you not lend a knee?" And the Duke insists. He dies for Claudio's death. And finally, Isabella gives in. She says, "Most bounteous sir, look, if it please you, on this man condemned as if my brother lived. I partly think a due sincerity governed his deeds till he did look on me. Since it is so, let him not die. My brother had but justice in that he did the thing for which he died. For Angelo, his act did not overtake his bad intent." She's talking about the act of executing her brother. "His act did not overtake his bad intent, and must be buried but as an intent that perished by the way. Thoughts are no subjects, intents, but merely thoughts." So a complicated speech that has disturbed readers. It's seen as a sign of hypocrisy in Isabella. So finally, the last scene we're going to talk about, Act 5, Scene 1, lines 482 to 542. This is the very end. The Duke pardons Barnardine, punks Lucio, and proposes to Isabella. So like I said at the beginning, Measure for Measure follows the comedic formula of crises resolved by marriage, but the marriages here do not lead to celebrations. They are solemn, they are somber, they are guilt-ridden. Angelo's tricked into a marriage that he did not want. Claudio is revealed to be alive and granted freedom, but neither he nor Juliet speak to their love in this scene or their happiness, even after they've been reunited on stage. They don't say anything. Lucio is sentenced to marry Kate Keepdown. And Lucio says, "Marrying a punk, my lord, is pressing to death, whipping and hanging." And most interestingly, it's unclear how Isabella receives the Duke's proposal. If you look at lines 495 to 97, for example, the Duke is speaking here, and he says to her, "For your lovely sake, give me your hand and say you will be mine. He is my brother too." And then there's a pause. And the Duke says, "But fitter time for that." And this often gets staged as he's offering his hand and Isabella refuses to take it. And so he ends the conversation. There's a pause. And then he says, "Well, there'll be fitter time for that." And then he returns to it at the end of the scene. But how she receives his proposal, how the audience would have received it, is an interesting question. It comes as a bit of a surprise, considering that the Duke has throughout the play prided himself on a celibate lifestyle, while Isabella herself, just a few days before all this started, was preparing to join the Sisterhood of St. Clare's. So it seems highly presumptuous of the Duke to expect an affirmative response to his proposal. So it's really interesting to see how that proposal and Isabella's reaction to it is handled in stage productions. And so with that, we'll conclude this video on Measure for Measure.